Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. My guest today is Dr. Michael Shermer, founder of the Skeptic Society and publisher of Skeptic Magazine. He's the author of numerous books on science and skepticism, and he's appeared on TV many times. And we're here to talk about his latest project, Conspiracies and Conspiracy Theories, for the Great Courses and Audible. So, Dr. Shermer, thank you for being here and welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. You were one of my inspirations to do this course because I loved your book, Escaping the Rabbit Hole. As you know, I quote from it in numerous of the 12 lectures.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to come across my name a couple of times as I was listening to it. Now, this is it's an interesting project, and I think it's kind of like a new thing for Audible and the Great Courses. It's kind of almost like a collaboration. It's almost like a book or a course. I mean,
yeah, so they're branching out and trying different things. You know, Audible actually had evolved from books on tape back in the 80s and 90s. I used to listen to audiobooks on cassette tapes with a Sony Walkman. That's how far back I go. And it was always a great way to consume content when you're driving or working out or doing chores or whatever. So I would do that. Then I had already done a course for the teaching company, Skepticism 101. It's based on the course I teach at Chapman University. And so one of the chapters was on conspiracy theories, because that's a topic we deal with in Skeptic Magazine all the time. And so then I thought, well, they should do a course just on conspiracy theories, because there was nothing in the catalog of the great courses on conspiracy theories. And I thought, well, that would be a good time to do it. And there's a ton of books. I get, books for review all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I had a huge stack of conspiracy books, including yours. And I thought, well, I got it all right here. I could just knock out a course probably in a few months. So I did. Since the Trump election, conspiracy theories are back in the news big time. So I think it is pretty important to deal with it, particularly so many of these, sort of white supremacists and populists and extremists of left and right have conspiracy theories behind them for what motivates them, at least what they say motivates them. So I thought, boy, this is really an important topic, not just a kind of a fringe, like dealing with the flat earthers like you've done so well. It's kind of fun, but they're pretty harmless. Yeah. They're not going to go out and commit mass genocide in the name of the flat earthers versus the globalists. Hopefully not. But other conspiracy theorists, they are potentially dangerous. So it's important we understand them.
Yeah, and that's certainly a theme that runs through your book, The Real Harm of Conspiracy Theorists. I really like the way you did the book, in that you, I think, try to give a lot of context to things. And you start off with the book in lesson number 1. You talk about some very obvious things like the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, where some guy shot up a mosque, and he was kind of like basing his rationale for that essentially on conspiracy theorists. So there are things that you set out saying the harm is real, which I think is very important.
Yeah, when these guys post their so-called manifestos, and you can go back to read, say, the Unabomber's manifesto, they are really a type of conspiracy theory. Either overt conspiracy where some government agent or agency is doing something to us, or it's more of a sort of subtle long-term trends of history conspiracy theory where, technological society is moving in this direction and it's ruining our lives and we have to reverse it. Case of the Unabomber. Those are all kinds of conspiracy theories, things that they think are true that we can test whether they're true or not, but have effects on behavior.
Yeah, and another kind of thing you do in the book, I think, quite well, is that you make the point throughout the book, but especially in the first chapter and the last chapter, that there are lots of very real conspiracies, and that we need to be aware of these things as well. So I mean, that's kind of like the subtitle of your book is like, what should you believe and why? So you start out, and I think this is a great way of talking to conspiracy theorists, is starting out by listing a whole bunch of very real conspiracies.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's not. It's also a good strategy in terms of like what you talk about in Escaping the Rabbit Hole, of how you talk to people in a way to engage them so they'll be honest and forthright with their beliefs. One way is to acknowledge that sometimes they may be right, and I find this the case when I was on Joe Rogan's show several times that you've been on. He's really open to a lot of these conspiracy theories. I think maybe more open-minded than I am about some of them. But the fact is, sometimes even Alex Jones is right. And so we have to acknowledge that. We can't just say, well, because Alex Jones said it, that therefore it can't be true because he's crazy. Sometimes he's right. And so the rub here is, well, which are the true conspiracy theories and which are the false conspiracy theories? So that's why I started making a distinction between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy is, a plot, or, in secret by two or more people to gain a moral or immoral or illegal advantage over somebody else or some other group of people. That does happen. Then the theory is the structured belief system around the conspiracy itself. The question is the conspiracy theory true or not, which would then reflect on whether the conspiracy itself happened or not.
All right, so what is real and what isn't? It's a very difficult thing. Like we talk about the demarcation problem, like you mentioned that later on. But moving on to kind of lesson 2 here, you talk about the different ways of classifying conspiracy theories, and there seems to be lots of different ways in which people classify what is a conspiracy theory and what are the types of conspiracy theory. I mean, do you think there's some kind of confusion here that we need to kind of settle on a language that we can all use to talk about them?
Yeah, I found that quite interesting, that there was no kind of theoretical model over the study of conspiracy theories like in other branches of the social sciences. The theorists and the experimentalists have kind of settled on a particular framework about how they're going to talk about the subject and test it and then try to find some causal explanations for whatever it is they're studying. There still isn't really anything quite like that for conspiracies and conspiracy theories, I think in part because it's always been treated by scientists as kind of a fringy, nutty, borderlands area that real scientists don't study. And it's only just recently, maybe in the last 10, 15 years, that a handful of social scientists have said, well, let's actually study this. Let's actually do a survey and find out how many Americans or Brits or Europeans or Germans or whatever believe this or that, and not just the moon landing or some crazy flat earthers or things like that, but other things like, to what extent do you think the government has conspired to alter the immigration policy that will harm our nation? That's a real issue that's in the news pretty much every day. So that's why, I kind of dove into that. I'll just go through some of these from my notes because I haven't looked at this in a while, but, just by category, anti-Semitism, aliens, aviation, government, medicine, religion, science and technology, suspicious deaths, of course, is always a popular one.
The Clinton body count is a very popular thing nowadays.
it went up with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes.
His suicide. That was actually an interesting case on Twitter because I was posting skepticism about the Jeffrey Epstein so-called suicide, that maybe he was murdered. I was pretty skeptical of that until the story about the 2 cameras both failed in the hallways. Like, okay, that does look pretty bad. Now that's not proof that he was murdered or that the Clintons or whoever ordered him to be murdered. Maybe it was that, cameras do fail. It's possible. But to me, it was almost reaching that tipping point or that kind of demarcation line you talk about of enough stuff builds up and you think, okay, that's pretty suspicious.
Yeah, I think certainly it's very difficult just when people just list the facts like that. The guard didn't check on him; he was taken off suicide watch, and then the cameras weren't working, and he had access to a bunk bed to hang himself from. It all seems very suspicious, but of course, it all could be things that are coincidences, or maybe not even so much coincidences. Like they had a crappy video system in the jail or things like that. It's difficult to tell without context. But you can certainly see how people would get suspicious about things like that.
After I posted that on Twitter, somebody who works in the prison system wrote me to say, you know what, actually the video camera systems are pretty crappy in these prisons, and they break down all the time. I went, oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Maybe I should go back to being skeptical of the Epstein case. I like the framework that Jesse Walker outlined in the United States of Paranoia. He has 5 different types of conspiracy theories: the enemy outside, theories based on figures alleged to be scheming against a community from without, and then the enemy within. Conspirators are working within our nation or our group. The enemy above, some powerful people manipulating things. The enemy below features the lower classes working to overturn the social order. A lot of conspiracies about unions and Marxists and things like that. And then his fifth one was the benevolent conspiracies, are angelic forces that work behind the scenes to improve the world and help people. I find almost no conspiracy theories are positive like that. You know, when you track moral progress over the centuries, like people like myself and Steven Pinker have done, there are very rarely conspiracy theories about, you know, people working to make things better. You know, most of the conspiracy theories have a negative valence to them. You know, people are conspiring to do harm to somebody else, you know. So anyway, I like that. I thought that was probably the most interesting of the different frameworks. I mean, how do you classify conspiracy theories?
I kind of don't really. I mean, I think in a way I would do it just on the simple way that you listed by the types of theories, like, you know, aliens, anti-Semitism, whatever, science. Because I look at like individual things like chemtrails, and I find, you know, with the spectrum, things kind of, an individual conspiracy can span the spectrum quite a bit. So it can kind of cross over various categories. Like with the 9/11 stuff, you could be part of some kind of New World Order Zionist, you know, Illuminati type thing, or it could just be, you know, something smaller like the Project for a New American Century, wanting to further their goals in the Middle East. So they aren't always necessarily easy to pigeonhole. So perhaps we do need these different ways of classifying them. Like, you know, you slice them this way and you slice them that way, and you get a different perspective on what it is.
Yeah, I added my own, just a twofold one of paranoid conspiracy theories versus realistic conspiracy theories. So the paranoid ones include aliens, evil forces, world domination schemes, or cabal so numerous and plots so complicated that they can never be pulled off, like the Bilderbergers, Rockefellers, and Rothschilds running the world's economies and obviously doing a crappy job of it. The Illuminati determining political elections and power relations, even 9/11 is an inside job. I consider all those to be too paranoid to be realistic, and realistic ones more like, you know, Volkswagen conspiring to cheat the emissions regulations in Europe, you know, Watergate, maybe the Russian hacking of the 2016 election, you know, those, you know, Wells Fargo opening fake bank accounts. Those things are, not only are they real, but that's really more accurate of what actually happens. Most conspiracies that are real are kind of more narrowly focused. You know, some direct targeted thing, just that thing right there, you know. So you can definitely see, like, Putin and his colleagues there operating to manipulate social media to give Trump, you know, it's a very specific thing. It's not like the conspiracy theory is that Putin wants to take over the world, you know.
Which like, he probably does.
he may very well, or at least probably wants to cobble together something like a USSR in all those Baltic states and so on. He would probably like to do that. I don't think he can do that anymore. You know, just what he did with the Crimea, that was a conspiracy, and he pulled it off. Although it wasn't such a secret conspiracy, but he kind of tried to make it that way. Remember, the Russian soldiers were not wearing uniforms, and so it wasn't clear who it was.
Little green men, they called them. That was an interesting thing. They refer to them as little green men because I think they wore green. I guess they were short or something. But then a bunch of people thought that was evidence that there were aliens in our midst, because there were stories about the army talking about little green men.
Yeah.
So there was a short-lived flurry of interesting aliens at the time.
But a couple of generalizations that some social scientists have made is having to do with power. That is, people out of power tend to think people in power have more power than they actually have, and therefore that makes them more paranoid or more concerned or anxious about what they may be doing behind closed doors. Yeah. Now, it turns out that, you know, that Fortune 500 CEOs and major politicians generally don't have as much power as we think that they do, and the people that get in there are often surprised about what they can't do. You know, it's like the joke I make about, you know, when you get elected president, they take you in the back room and they go, okay, here's what's actually going on in the Middle East. This is why we can't pull the troops out. This is why we can't close Gitmo. This is why we can't end this war, and so on. And look what just happened yesterday with, you know, Trump says, you know, okay, I'm going to pull the troops out of out of northern Syria, and Turkey's going to go do their thing. It's like, we've been there forever. Enough is enough. Boom. Even his own party leaders were, hard on that. It's like, wait, we were doing what again now? Because I didn't really follow that. The Kurds and this and that. Oh, okay. So we've been knee deep in the muddy there for a long time. And, a lot of this stuff goes on behind closed doors and phone calls and so on, and then stuff happens. That's a kind of conspiracy, but again, it's very narrowly focused, having to do with power. And, so some of the research shows, for example, that there's no racial differences in conspiracy thinking, but the target of the conspiracy theory is racially bound. So African Americans, for example, are more likely to think the government conspired to plant crack cocaine in inner cities, or created the AIDS virus to decimate the African American population. Whites don't worry about that. Whites worry about, the government's conspiring to take away the Second Amendment and confiscate our guns, that sort of thing. So no difference between blacks and whites, except for the kinds of conspiracy that they embrace. Having, again, to do with somebody's trying to control us, some powerful entity. Usually it's a government agency, but sometimes corporations. So the power thing, although I'm not sure how the power thing would involve, say, the flat earthers or maybe the creationists or something like that.
Yeah. They do think it's kind of a power thing, the flat earth people. They think that tricking people into believing the earth is round is a way of the powers that be kind of asserting their authority over people. It's kind of like the thing in 1984 where you make someone believe something that is false, 2 + 2 = 5. Right. If you can force someone to believe something that is false, then you have control over their mind.
That's true. That is a kind of power. That's right, a psychological power. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was curious if you'd seen that Netflix film Behind the Curve about the flat Earth. Yeah, you've probably seen that. I was thinking about the psychology of the people that attended that conference. That they had the camera crew there, and I think you might be right. There might be a sense of empowerment that we're in this room, and those of us behind these closed doors here, we know what's really going on. And you can kind of see it in their faces. Maybe they're otherwise kind of nerdy, powerless people or whatever. But now they have, at that moment, like we are empowered with this secret knowledge.
Yeah, they really enjoy it. I actually went to a Flat Earth conference. I got invited to speak there. It was this weird one. Have you heard of Mad Mike Hughes, the rocket guy who's trying to shoot a steam rocket up?
Right.
He organized the little conference, and they invited me as the kind of guest of honor to speak from the skeptic point of view. And so I got to talk there and meet all these people. It was a very, very poorly attended conference, but the people there were really nice, and they just seemed, on the whole, to be just like ordinary people, maybe a little bit more kind of like hippie and crystal type people than average, but still they were just ordinary people, and it was kind of very strange that they have this normalcy, and then they also have this very, very weird set of beliefs. But then I guess lots of people have strange beliefs, as you know, people believe in all kinds of weird things.
I went back in the '90s. I went to an alien abductee conference and met a bunch of them, and it was the same kind of thing. It's like otherwise they're just sort of normal, powerless people, but in this room, it's like we have all shared this experience. We know it's real, and they had kind of read a little bit about sleep paralysis and some of the psychological explanations. This is all in your head. They absolutely reject that, and they think something did happen to us. It's almost like a chosen people kind of thing. Wow, the aliens are out there and they care about us. I mean, they cared about us enough to come into my bedroom in the middle of the night and take me away. And that you could kind of see the empowerment that they gave them. Like, I have this knowledge about this thing that happened. My friend Lee McIntyre, who's a philosopher of science at Boston University, he wrote a book called Post-Truth, and then his new book is The Scientific Attitude. He was just a guest lecturer in my Chapman class Monday night, and he was talking about, he went to one of these flat Earth conferences, just the one last, maybe, 6 months ago or so, here in the States. And he said it was the same kind of thing, like behind these closed doors in this hotel conference room, boy, we have got the special knowledge. And he didn't exactly go undercover. He was just quiet. He signed up, paid the entry fee and so on, and just sat there for the first day. But the second day, he came out as a skeptic. I actually don't believe this. And I'm a social science, I'm a philosopher, not a physicist, but, let's just go through some of the arguments. And so he was curious, as a philosopher who studies reasoning, if he could reason people out of a belief that they hold. Because this is an interesting new area of research now, the backfire effect. When you talk to somebody about climate change, they double down on it. But those studies have not been replicated, and now there's some new research showing that you actually can talk people out of, say, climate denial or creationism or whatever. But it has to be done in a particular way where you're not insulting, you're not challenging their deeper worldview. You present the facts in a way that it kind of, particularly a visual data rather than just numbers. Apparently, we're a visual primate species, so we respond more to visual stimuli. And he kind of went through a handful of these things that I too have experienced. Like if you tell people you got to choose between Darwin and Jesus, they're not picking Darwin. But don't couch it like that. You have to give up. I have to give up my entire Christian worldview and everything I believe my whole life for this theory of evolution. Forget it. Yeah.
It's very difficult to get around that kind of false dichotomy, though. I talk to the UFO people quite a lot, and they always kind of leap from me explaining one particular thing to saying that, oh well, you haven't debunked UFOs, as if I was trying to debunk UFOs. So now I have to start out saying this doesn't prove everything, or at the end of a little video I will put in a disclaimer saying all I've done is explain this one little thing, and that doesn't mean anything about any of the other beliefs or the other cases or the other bits of evidence. So I think they kind of automatically leap from one thing being wrong to everything being wrong, which makes it very difficult to actually address like individual pieces of evidence.
Yeah, Steve Pinker makes this point about climate change, that it got affiliated or tethered to liberalism because Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth was so huge, won an Oscar and Academy or whatever it won, and of course he was the vice president of the the Liberal Party. So now climate change becomes a liberal cause. So even if you know nothing about it, you have to be against it if you're a conservative Republican, because it's a left wing thing. So when you comment publicly, Pinker makes this point that most people don't know anything about climate science. It's a technical science. So, but I can virtue signal to my group, I'm so committed to our party that I'm going to deny this theory over here. And in a way, I think that explains a lot of what goes on here. You don't have to know the arguments and the specific things. I'm just giving a virtue signal that I belong to this group by endorsing this or denying that.
Yeah, I think that kind of extends to individuals as well. I remember you were on a show called Conspiracy Road Trip like years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember there was a scene where I think they introduced you to the conspiracists, and you got on the bus, and there was one woman there, and she was like, "Oh, I know who you are. I'm not going to listen to anything you say." And she kind of was ready to dismiss everything you said just because you are Michael Shermer, a skeptic who she knew was kind of opposed to her. So you get this automatic poisoning the well thing, which is also a very difficult thing to get around.
Yeah, we ended up actually having drinks later on with the whole group at the bar after the sort of post-wrap dinner that they had for all of us. And she was super friendly at that point.
Right.
She even said, I had no idea. I thought you were just this asshole, just this fucking person I just wanted to hate. And you're a nice guy. And it's like, okay, so maybe it pays to be a nice guy at the start.
It's interesting because I've had the exact same reaction. Like when I went to the Flat Earth conference, I'm a nice guy. I chat with people and I'm friendly and everything. And everyone was like, "Whoa, you're Mick West? Like, I thought you were going to be some kind of like arrogant, know-it-all asshole who was like making fun of us." And so, I think it's you've got to get that across there to people. Yeah, and meeting people is a great way of doing it, but otherwise it's difficult.
And also, dining and drinking with people is a more social friendly thing. Back in the 90s, when I first started investigating the Holocaust deniers, of course they don't call themselves that, but they were in Costa Mesa, right down the road from me. So I went down to the Institute for Historical Review and met them. Now they have kind of a conspiracy theory, the Jews are doing this and the Jews are doing that, and it's pretty obvious once you dig not even very deep. That there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and particularly anti-Zionism. They don't like Israel. But they really warmed up to me, just like not the formal interview, with the microphone and stuff, but actually just going out for a beer and pizza afterwards. And, they kind of open up. At first they didn't say much about Israel and the Jews. They're just saying, well, we just doubt the specific thing right here. There were no holes in the gas chamber at Auschwitz, Birkenau, Crema number 2. This was such a classic case of, if I can get some little minutia thing and show that it's wrong, then the whole edifice will collapse. And this became actually a little rallying cry in David Irving's trial in England, where no holes, no Holocaust. It's like, what? People could not figure out what the hell this had to do with. Well, so he says if you go to Auschwitz-Birkenau and you go to Crema 2 or 3, the 2 big ones, there was 4 there actually, but the 2 big ones there, and there's no holes on the gas chamber ceilings. Well, these were subterranean gas chambers. The ceiling was maybe 3 feet high, and the induction ports where they poured the Zyklon B into the chamber were just maybe another foot or 2 above this subterranean thing. Anyway, the eyewitnesses said the SS guards clambered up on top of this roof and then took the lid off and poured the Zyklon B pellets into the wire mesh columns, and then so that the gassing would occur. Okay, so and if you go there, there's no holes, says David Irving. So it's like, what? So if that was not true, then maybe no one was gassed at Auschwitz, and if no one was gassed at Auschwitz, maybe no one was gassed at Majdanek and Treblinka, and so no one was gassed anywhere. Maybe the Nazis did not have a plan to exterminate European Jewry. Maybe all those deaths we've seen, not as many as 6 million, but maybe a couple 100,000 to 1 million or 2, those were due to disease and overwork and war is bad and so on. Okay, that's their argument. But if you go to Auschwitz-Birkenau, to Crema 2, you'll see there's no holes because there's no roof. The Nazis dynamited the whole place as the Russians were moving in January of 1945.
Oh,
it's like, well, I've confronted him about this, and he doesn't back down. No holes, no Holocaust. I kind of went down this little rabbit hole.
It's an interesting thing.
As an example of, just how you take one little tiny thing and try to, to take down the entire edifice. And you make this point also when you deal with the 9/11 truthers that, they kind of feel like if you can't explain every single anomaly, and the problem is we can't explain every single anomaly. Richard Dawkins makes this point about the creationists. They'll say, if you can't explain the left elbow of the Amazon green tree frog and where that came from, then therefore evolution did not happen, and therefore no species evolved. And he's like, we can't explain every single little thing about the living world. And in any major event like 9/11, there's going to be just little weird things that happen. And the same thing with the Holocaust. They made a big thing about the door at the gas chamber at Majdanek doesn't lock. And if you can't lock a gas chamber door, how are you going to gas a bunch of people who are going to want to push it out? So we went there. My co-author, Alex Grobman, and I went there. And I had a list because when I went down to visit them in Costa Mesa, I said, give me your best arguments. Give me like the 20 best arguments you have for why you think the Holocaust didn't happen. So they did. So I kind of went down the list as I was writing my book on this. And so one of them was this door doesn't lock. So Alex and I go there, and the door is this big metal door that has a handle that kind of moves like that. And so the handle should go like that, where it locks into the door jamb on this side. And sure enough, there was no hole for this thing to jam into. You could not lock the door. And I thought, that is kind of weird. So I said, all right, Alex, I'm going to get in the gas chamber, and you hold the door and see if I can push it open. Of course, I shouldered into it, and no problem, pushed the door right open. It's like, yeah, that is kind of weird. So we had a little guide, like a 20-year-old girl, walking us around, and I go, do you know why the door doesn't lock? She's like, no. So then she gets the next person up, and do you know the door doesn't lock? It's like, yeah, doesn't that seem kind of weird? I don't know. I didn't even know. And then I get the next person up, and then finally the head of the whole Majdanek camp, which is now a museum. He's like, what's this about the door doesn't lock? I go, yeah, you never noticed that? He goes, no. And then next thing I know, we got kicked out of the camp. Basically, they thought maybe we were there to cause trouble or something. And I got a phone call there. They go, you have a phone call, Dr. Sherman. I'm like, me? At Majdanek? What? And it was the head of the interior of all of Austria who runs all of their parks and camps and museums and the whole thing. He goes, what's this about the door doesn't lock? I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this. I said, we're just here to debunk the deniers. And there's Alex with his yarmulke. We're not skinheads or something, right? And they said, we have no idea. Anyway, it took me 2 years to find out that that door was taken off after the war and shipped off to Hungary for some museum. And they just stuck some other door on there.
Right.
Mystery solved. But for the deniers, it's like, aha, we got you on that one little thing right there. And if you can't get that, then no Holocaust.
Well, it's interesting. Like, no one knew about it because for most people, it wasn't really an important point. It's because they all knew that the Holocaust happened, so they didn't really look about it. And that's kind of like a problem you come across is kind of asymmetry of interest in things. You get these conspiracy theorists, and they're really, really into these things. So they spend hours and hours going over all the details, and then you get on the other side. Most mainstream scientists and historians are not interested. Sure, more about Holocaust denial, but things like 9/11 and chemtrails and stuff, there's very, very few experts who are interested in it. So you get, in a way, like this swarm of conspiracy theorists on one side, and then you get a few debunkers like me and you on the other side, and you can kind of get a bit overwhelmed in a way because there's just so many different things coming in. So that's kind of why I try to use the tactic of getting them to focus on one thing. And really focus on one thing, because the technique of the Gish Gallop, where they'll just list off a whole bunch of things,
right?
But you got to stop them and say, what's your one best piece of evidence? And a lot of the time, they're really reluctant to give you their best piece of evidence because they know that you'll be able to explain it. And they'll say, no, I'm not doing that because you'll just explain it away. And I'd say, yeah, that's the whole point.
That's the whole point.
Your best evidence is easily explainable. So, what does that say about the rest of the evidence?
The other problem is the difficulty all of us have cognitively of being comfortable with uncertainty. Like just saying, I have no idea why the door doesn't lock or this particular thing there. And so on. Most of the Holocaust historians I initially interviewed when I was writing my book, they had no idea about most of the things on that list. And it's like, why would we know that? It's just some tiny little minutia that makes no difference, really. And so it was kind of hard to track a lot of them down. I noticed the 9/11 truthers do that.
Yeah,
like there was something about, somebody's passport ended up on the street that was in the plane. Well, it's like, I don't, what? And they have a list of things like that, just tiny little things. And anyway, so back to that, my friend Lee McIntyre, one of the points he made was to the flat earthers, I think maybe you did this, was what would it take to change your mind? What just can you and I agree on some test we could do that I'll change my mind and agree you're right, or you'll change your mind and agree I'm right, if we can look at this one thing right here. So we actually got one of them to agree that they would take a flight from New Zealand over to across the South Pole and so on. And the guy was ready to do it, and like, okay, if we can actually do this, then I'll agree that it's a globe, and Antarctica, as you know, they don't think Antarctica exists. It's an ice wall. Then he changed his mind later and said, no, I think if the pilots are in on the conspiracy, they're just going to fly around the ice wall, and it'll look like a continent, but it's not actually a continent. And if your theory is not testable, if it is absolutely irrefutably true and there's nothing you can do to change my mind, then you're really off the page of having a conversation.
Yeah, and these kind of like psychological things are stuff that you talk about in lessons 3 and 4. We're already half an hour in, and we're only at lesson 3, so you should pick up the pace. But yeah, you talk a lot about the cognitive biases that people have, and I think like the big one. I was going to ask you, like, if you were to pick one of the cognitive biases, what do you think is the most significant of all the cognitive biases?
Well, the two big ones for conspiracy theorists is confirmation bias and the hindsight bias. Confirmation bias you look for and find confirming evidence that fits what you already believe, and you ignore the disconfirming evidence. Everybody does it. And this is what really fuels conspiracy. Once you think the Jews are doing this or the Muslims are doing that, then all you got to do is just read the daily newspaper or just kind of look around and go, aha, example, 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 ignoring all the counterexamples. And that's probably the biggest one. In the case of conspiracy theories, I find the hindsight bias. After the fact reasoning, after something happens, then you go back and look at the assorted evidence and stuff that was going on at the time and think, well, they should have known. Like this happened with the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theorists, that Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack in Pearl Harbor because, look, here's a piece of intel here and here. There's 3 or 4 of these that, the Japanese may attack in the Hawaiian Islands. But when you go back and look at the historical record, in fact, we had broken their code, and there was like 10,000 pieces of evidence and intel about what the Japanese might do. And you simply can't know until it already happens which are the ones that we should have been paying attention to. This is, of course, a big problem with intelligence agencies. And the same thing happened with 9/11, that, there was that August 9th memo from Condoleezza Rice to Bush and his administration. Al-Qaeda intends to attack the United States on U.S. soil. Okay, how could he have? He obviously, Bush knew this was going to happen. That was August 9th. That was weeks before 9/11. And then when you look at what actually was going on, again, 10,000 pieces of intel about what Al-Qaeda was doing all over the world. Only after the fact do you look at it and go, oh, that's the one that we should have paid attention to, which is really not fair to intelligence agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about with the Pearl Harbor thing, like the other intelligence was about them actually attacking other things, like in the Philippines or somewhere like that, or
right.
Or even attacks on mainland United States. They were chattering about all kinds of things. I think you said there was so much information coming through that they actually kind of stopped forwarding some of it because they were afraid it was going to leak and the Japanese would figure out that they were intercepting and breaking their code. There's just so much stuff. But yeah, another example you gave was the space shuttle. Like people thought in hindsight that it was obvious that the space shuttle was going to fail because it's obvious that if you cool this particular O-ring down, then it loses its stiffness, its flexibility. But again, that's the hindsight bias in action.
Yeah, exactly. After a disaster, it's easy to figure out what we should have done to prevent it. Complex systems like that, economies, political systems, complex machines like the space shuttle, things are bound to go wrong. The second law of thermodynamics, entropy, there's more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. Inevitably, systems are going to fail, but it's so difficult to predict ahead of time, which pathway is going to end up leading to failure. Only after the fact, and then you throw in some patternicity and agenticity where you are sure there's some agent behind the pattern you've just found in hindsight that was pulling the strings to make it happen, or they should have prevented it from happening, and that sort of thing. Again, hindsight is 20/20, and that's the problem.
Yeah, I was actually thinking you were going to go for cognitive dissonance because that seems to be the thing that's underlying everything.
Yeah, that's true. That's another underlying one. Carol Tavris has a great book on that. Mistakes were made, but not by me. And sort of the whole history of the literature on cognitive dissonance. I liked it with conspiracy theories because there's a dissonance between the size of the event and the cause of the event. So the assassination of JFK, the most powerful leader of the free world and articulate and handsome and so on, and he was taken out by who? Lee Harvey Oswald, some lone nut? No, that doesn't, So we want it's like the Holocaust is one of the worst things that's ever happened in history, committed by the Nazis, one of the worst regimes in history. So there's kind of a harmony between the cause and the effect. 9/11. You've heard the 9/11 truthers say this. You mean 19 guys with box cutters brought down the world's largest military? Come on, impossible. Again, you have the size of the cause and the size of the event, the size of the cause doesn't feel right. Princess Diana, cause of death, drunk driving, speeding, no seatbelts. I don't know, what is it? 1 million people a year die of those causes in automobile accidents around the world. Something like 40,000 in America alone. Most of those are by one of those three causes or all three. But princesses don't die the way normal people die. So it had to be the royal family or whoever, MI5 and so on that were in on it. So you start stacking in more and more people to make the cognitive dissonance balance, and so you have harmony. So again, JFK was the Cubans and the Russians and the KGB and the CIA and so on. They all were in on it all the way up to President Johnson. And I thought Oliver Stone's film, and this is another sort of sidebar, the power of visual narrative. Oliver Stone is such a good filmmaker that, even though I was pretty skeptical of most of this, by the time I got to the end of that film, I thought, my God, if only like a half of this is true or 10% of it is true, there's got to be a conspiracy.
Yeah.
And then websites popped up going, here's the 100 things he got wrong in this movie. It's like, oh, crap. Wow.
Yeah, I remember watching JFK. And I didn't really know very much about the conspiracy theories at the time, and you just see it all laid out on screen in such a compelling way that it's like hammering it into your brain that this is obviously very, very suspicious, and something must have gone wrong. Like they talk about the one thing is the magic bullet, and of course they portray it in the movie as if the bullet had to change direction in midair and do a twist and things like that, and then magically come out unscathed the other side. And when you see it there on the big screen, even though it's just a movie, it really is very compelling.
Totally. Back and to the left, back and to the left. They just repeated that.
Yes.
It's like, my God, yes, look, it's going back and to the left. Wow.
Yeah, that's... do you think, like, if we hadn't had the JFK movie, the kind of the conspiracy sphere would be at all different?
Regarding JFK or all conspiracies?
Well, both. Like, with JFK, like, I think so many people were influenced by it. But then JFK, in a way, is kind of a foundational belief for a lot of conspiracy theorists.
Yeah. Vincent Bugliosi has a story in his huge book on Reclaiming History, it's called. And he, to his credit, he went through every single one of the JFK conspiracy theorists in detail, every single minutia point, which is why that book is like 1,400 pages long. But he talked about, he was at a conference of lawyers right after the JFK film came out, and everybody'd seen it. How many of you seen? Oh, everybody'd seen it. How many think that that the Warren report was mistaken and that there was a conspiracy? Pretty much every hand goes up. It's like, how many of you have read the Warren report? Nobody read the Warren report. And so here's a room full of criminal lawyers. This is their job, and they had not even read the report, and they've already decided simply by the power of the film.
Yeah.
And
it's exactly the same with 9/11. They don't read the reports, the NIST report or the 9/11 Commission report. Even though these are great reports and they've got lots of detail in them, they're just assuming that they're wrong.
That's right. Yeah. Well, even Loose Change, which was nothing like an Oliver Stone film with movie stars, it was long enough and there was enough stuff tossed into the mix, and the way the guy presented it, like, I'm not saying this is, but I'm just saying, I'm just curious. I just can't explain. I'm not sure what this is. This kind of weird, and I'm totally skeptical of Loose Change, but I'm watching it going, yeah, that is kind of weird. And until you get into it and go, oh, okay, so this and this and this and this, has explanations. And again, back to the problem of anomalies. Maybe this would be another one of our cognitive biases, is that we're not comfortable with unknown anomalies. We want an explanation for everything, and it's just okay to say I don't know. I mean, like with the UFO field, there's tens of thousands of sightings. I have no idea about most of those 10,000. I can explain these over here, the big ones, but it's okay to just say I don't know what it was. Maybe it was a flock of geese. Maybe it was a experimental test plane. Maybe it was a balloon. Who knows? Yeah. But psychologically, most of us are not comfortable with that.
Yeah, and you kind of talk about how these biases are kind of have evolutionary bases. Like people, it's a natural thing to be suspicious of things. But something else that you talk about that's kind of a natural thing is that the brain is a believing brain. So it almost seems like to me there's like this kind of conflict in a way in those two things. Like the brain has evolved to believe things, but it's also evolved to be very suspicious of things.
Yeah.
Are they different things?
I think they're related. Okay, so let's just unpack that. So, in the believing brain, I talked about the default position is just the moment you make a connection between A and B. This is called learning. The organism now associates the bell with the food, and therefore when you ring the bell, he salivates to the food, Pavlov's dog, or Skinner's rats pressing the bar. And so once they've learned it, they've assumed there's a real connection. And for good reason, because there probably really is a good connection. Then I make the argument about type 1 and type 2 errors. One is more costly than the other. If you hear a rustle in the grass, is it a dangerous predator or just the wind? I'm arguing natural selection would have selected us to have brains that just assume the rustles in the grass are more likely to be dangerous predators, because assuming that it's the dangerous predator and it turns out it's just the wind, a type 1 error, false positive, is a relatively low cost error to make. no harm, no foul. But if you assume the other, that the rustle in the grass is just the wind, and instead it's a dangerous predator, your lunch. You get a Darwin Award for taking yourself out of the gene pool early. So natural selection selected for us to assume most rustles in the grass are dangerous predators. Okay, so this was my argument for why, a deeper reason for why people believe weird things is because we have to believe things. And weird things are not generally all that costly, so it's just easier to assume most things are true. And so this is the basis of magical thinking, superstition, even claims like autism and vaccinations. That's a simple anecdotal, what's the last thing I did before my kid got diagnosed with autism? Oh, I remember, we got him vaccinated. And then you get that meme going, and then you have that one study that was debunked, but no one accepts the debunking of the study by Wakefield. And now you have this whole movement of, which is a kind of conspiracy theory. The government and the pharmaceutical companies are all in on the vaccines, and they don't care about our kids. So it's just crazy. But the deeper cause behind that is just anecdotal thinking, connecting A to B. And then I add to that patternicity, agenticity, that we infuse those patterns with agency. There's somebody behind that pattern that's making that happen, that causes that. Because predators are intentional agents. Dan Dennett makes this argument about intentionality, that our brains are wired to assume kind of an agency or intention behind causal vectors. So we're not wired really well to understand the physical world, quantum physics and so on. There's nothing in our African ancestry to glom onto most physical laws of nature. So we just assume that, the wind has something behind it, the lightning has gods behind it, or whatever, the basis of animism and spiritualism and polytheism and monotheism and so forth. Now, the second part to depack that is, I got this idea from Jared Diamond when he talked about going to Papua New Guinea and pitching his tent. He initially went to go birding because he was interested in ornithology, but they'd be out camping with his Papua New Guinean natives. And he said, well, let's pitch the tent underneath this tree. And they're like, no, trees fall, and then you would die in the middle of the night. He goes, well, the chances of that particular tree falling are very, very low. So that's too much paranoia. But then he got to thinking, well, if we sleep under a tree every single night for 365 days a year, and we hear trees falling maybe once every 1,000 trees or once every 1,000, a tree is going to kill you within 3 years. So it's best to be constructively paranoid. And then I drill down a little bit more on that to talk about, what's behind that is the second law of thermodynamics and entropy, and the fact that there's so many more ways for things to go wrong than right. In terms of our bodies, you have to have all these systems operating fairly well, effectively, to keep living. It only takes one of them to go wrong. The heart stops beating, a valve goes wrong, a brain bleed due to a clogged artery, whatever. There's 1,000 things that could kill you. And so Pinker makes this argument in his book Enlightenment Now that he's kind of summarizing the research on the negativity bias. That is, we tend to focus on negative things more than positive things. We have more words to describe negative things. Negative emotions have more adjectives than positive emotions, and on and on and on it goes. Athletes are more afraid of losing than they are winning. Economists talk about loss aversion. Losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. So you have to get somebody to make an investment. You have to convince them that the payoff is going to be twice what the potential loss could be before they're willing to take that. Anyway, I summarize all that.
Yeah, it's fascinating thinking about how the brain evolved to do that. But right now we're in a situation where conspiracy theories are about distrust of the government, those in power. Do you think that just kind of is like a translation of they believe weird things happen and something is behind that, and then the only thing that's available to be behind that is the government, so it naturally falls on the government as being the suspicious party.
Exactly. That's right. So again, most conspiracy theories have a negative valence to them, and this was my explanation for why. No one argues that there's been this conspiracy to drive the arc of the moral universe toward freedom and justice. That there's been these secret operative forces to, ban slavery and overturn capital punishment and end torture and give women the rights to vote and gays the right to marry and so on. No one has a conspiracy theory about this. In fact, when I wrote my book, The Moral Arc, it was kind of hard to figure out, what has been driving this? because there is a arc.
Yeah.
There's definitely a kind of progress to history, but it's just sort of this bottom-up, directionless. Nobody is trying to make this happen. Just all of us individually, women, protesting and demanding the right to vote against the resistance of the whole system, and so on. It's all this kind of bottom-up. Television scripts have changed, comic books have changed, television shows have changed. Just the way we talk about other people. Dawkins makes this point in The God Delusion. He has a chapter on the changing moral zeitgeist. Like, you could pinpoint when a novel was written down to about the decade as to how they talk about Jews and blacks and women. And it's like, and he gives examples, and they're just painful to read. It's like, oh my God, this was like not even a century ago. They were talking about Jews and blacks this way. Terrible. But how did that happen? No one conspired to make that happen. It just happened from the bottom up.
I suppose the religious people will say that it's part of God's plan, but then why did God start with everything being so bad?
Yeah. Or why did he wait 2,000 years, or whatever?
Yeah,
Jesus gave this commandment, and look, the Christians, led the abolition of slavery. It's like, hold on. First of all, that took 1,700 years between Jesus and the abolition of slavery, and second of all of the people that resisted the Quakers and a few Episcopalians and a few others were Christians. They all conspired to keep slavery going because it says right there in the Bible, this is the way it's supposed to be, and God wants the races to be on different continents. That was an argument made as late as 1967 in the United States in opposition to same-sex marriage, or interracial marriage. That God intended the races to be on separate continents. They should have never mixed. And it's like, this is 1960s. That's incredible.
Yeah. So, let's kind of going back through your course. You got two very good chapters, lessons 8 and 9, which are on 9/11 and JFK, and you did kind of a very detailed, kind of point by point debunking of the major issues in that. Like, did you pick those because those are the ones that you personally are most familiar with? Because you did these episodes of Skeptic Magazine on them.
Yeah, in part, but also because they're important, because people care about them. I mean, those are probably the two most popular conspiracy theories, as you know, because you've written about them, and you've gotten into the weeds with these guys. I mean, I was just watching the clip about the little Tic Tac UFO, and I don't remember if it was the Tic Tac or the other one, but it had to do with the camera zooming in and out that made it look like it was moving faster than any physical object can move, according to modern physics and so on. And to me, this was such a great example of what you did of debunking, in a way, a very specific way, to solve a much larger problem, which is that if I assume this is true, that this object I'm seeing on the video is moving faster than it is possible for any physical object to move under our current technological engineering capability, therefore it has to be extraterrestrial. How about your assumption that it's moving at that speed is wrong? What if it isn't accurately portrayed in a video, that the video zooming in and out is making it look like it's moving faster? Then everything else falls away. None of those explanations are necessary. To me, that's why it pays to get into the weeds. You have to do that with these conspiracists, because they're glomming onto that one little thing, and if you can show that one little thing is not necessarily true, then you kind of have to take a step back.
But then you do have to really address all of the weeds, because unfortunately they can just move to one different, weed, and go with that, like we were talking about earlier with the Gish Gallop. They don't like to pick one thing.
So the hard part there, is, as you know, is so they have, let's say, 100 points, and you explain 50 of them. What do you do with the other 50? And maybe they'll never be explained. There's there's anomalies. There was nobody else there in the wheat field at 3 a.m. Who knows what that thing was, if there was anything at all? And I guess it's just back to that psychology of just whether or not you're comfortable with uncertainty. People that are low on being uncomfortable with uncertainty are higher in conspiratorial thinking. We know this from research by psychologists that that people that are more fearful or anxious, either primed to be so in an experimental condition, or they are just by temperament, are more conspiratorially minded. My colleagues at Chapman did some studies on this, showing people that are more fearful or more conspiratorial minded are more likely to buy a gun, for example. It's like, ooh, oh boy, here we go, real world consequences of conspiratorial thinking.
The various studies that have been done, you talk about a lot of them in I think like lesson 3 about the correlations between various traits and conspiracism. Do you think those are useful to know when you're dealing with an individual? 'Cause, I mean, I think they're useful in the aggregate if you're thinking about like social policy or ways of reaching a large number of people. But are there other ways you can kind of leverage knowing that someone might be, wanting to have he has a certain pathonicity tendency or something like that for the individual? Because I kind of glossed over that a bit in my book, like it's not being that important because it's hard to apply to an individual.
I think it's good to know that just theoretically. I mean, if we want to construct a model of conspiracism, that's important to know. Engaging with people, no, I wouldn't say to somebody, oh, well, so you're a paranoid personality, or you're low in openness to experience, or you're high in conscientiousness, or whatever, because no one wants to be, stereotyped by something like that, because they don't think that in any case. I mean, again, just a point I make in other areas. No one in the history of the world has ever joined a cult. They join a group that they think is a really good group. We're going to help humanity. We're going to help the poor. I'm going to get rich and so forth. And no one in the history of the world is ever identified as a pseudoscientist. The people, all the so-called pseudoscientists I've dealt with, they all are sure that they have the correct theory of physics, or your theory of evolution is wrong, but I've got it all worked out here, and Einstein was wrong, and Stephen Hawking was wrong, and I have this new theory of physics. I get these theories every month, and it's like they don't think I'm a pseudoscientist going down to my pseudo lab to collect pseudo facts for my pseudo theory. They think they're right. So it doesn't help to gauge people on that level. I always just try to, again, like you, just try to be friendly, try to be respectful, and then ask some probing questions like, well, how do you know that's true? How did you arrive at that belief, and what would it take to change your mind? And see what they come up with.
Yeah. I mean, the important thing really is just keeping them talking and giving them new information.
I mean, the other thing on the 9/11 truther thing that I added to the course, I was thinking about Danny Kahneman's research on the conjunction fallacy. This is the famous Susan experiment. Susan was a social activist, and I forget what the characteristics are of her when she was in college. There's a whole list of these things, and then what's more likely, that Susan was a bank teller or that Susan is a bank teller and a feminist activist? And everybody thinks, well, she had to be a feminist activist and a bank teller because look at her history. But Kahneman's point was that the conjunction fallacy is that the probability of two independent factors happening at the same time is always going to be lower than either one of the independent factors happening. So I got to thinking about that. It's like that applies to the 9/11 truthers. We don't have to deal with any of this stuff of their thermite and super thermite and all their little arguments. They're claiming that the planes hit the buildings and this other independent thing happened, that explosive devices were planted in the buildings. Those are two separate independent events. The probabilities of both of those happening are lower than the probability of either one of them happening. We know the planes hit the building because we've seen the videos and so on, and tons of eyewitnesses. And so the probabilities that happened, which we know happened, and the explosive devices were planted in the buildings, and then that's fraught with problems. These are two of the most secure buildings in all of America. And under the pretenses of fixing the elevators, they snuck in, broke through the drywall, planted and so on. And they knew exactly which floors the planes were going to hit on, so they planted the explosive devices there on those particular floors, and on it goes. So the probabilities of all that happening are so low, to me, you wouldn't even need to bother with all the other arguments that they make.
It's hard. It's hard to talk about probabilities because they don't really make sense on an individual case like this, because things either happened or they didn't, and it's how do you talk about? I wasn't entirely convinced by your argument for the conjunction fallacy.
Okay,
so I think there's objections raised about the conjunction fallacy, like people take the question as meaning, was she a bank teller and not a feminist, or was she a bank teller and a feminist? I think a lot of people answering the question read it that way, and they think of these things as being separate, and they don't necessarily think that you're asking when you're asking about, say, was it planes or was it planes plus explosions? They're thinking you're asking, was it planes plus no explosions? So that really it boils down to just the left side of that argument, which would be like just the last bit.
But isn't that what 9/11 truthers believe? Most of them. I mean, you do talk about the demarcation line there. The no planers are skeptical of the ones that accept that the planes did hit the buildings, but just the ones that accept that the planes hit the buildings and that explosive devices were planted, right? Isn't that what they believe?
Yeah, but I think that's very much the mainstream for 9/11. The no-planers are a very, very small fringe minority of crazy people, essentially, who think that no planes hit the World Trade Center and it was all holograms or something. So when you're talking to 9/11 truther, they're all saying, yeah, planes hit the building. Some of them will say that they were remote-controlled planes, but then they're saying, in addition, there was a... so from their perspective, I don't think the probability of the plane hitting or not is really a factor there. The probability is you got to focus on is how plausible is it that you would have sneaked explosives into the buildings, which, as you know, is very implausible, especially as you pointed out on the same floor that the planes hit and was burning for nearly an hour before it collapsed.
Yeah. I mean, this again, another one of the points I enjoyed about your book was that line of demarcation. Such an important subject. I did this once. I had a three-way debate with a young Earth creationist and an older Earth creationist, and I represented the evolutionary position. And I just got the two of them going at each other. Started debunking each other's arguments. So I didn't have to do it. Because we all have that sort of line of demarcation where we draw the line there. But back to the conjunction fallacy. It does seem to me that just a simple argument, leaving out the details, that probabilities of the planes hitting the buildings and the explosive devices, leaving aside however they would have gotten them in there, isn't that a lower probability than either one of them happening independently? Sure,
but we know that the planes hit the buildings, and all the 9/11 truthers know the planes hit the buildings. It's not really, that's a 1 on the probability scale. So when you multiply them out, it comes out the same. But it's an interesting thing to think about, the conjunction fallacy. But I have problems with the way it's phrased like that.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I hadn't seen the critiques of the Susan conjunction fallacy. That is interesting. Although I guess it would apply to any conspiracy theory, because one of my sort of debunking points, again, that you make too, is that the more complex the system has to be, the more people that are have to be involved to pull it off, and the more things that have to happen in just the right sequence, the lower the probability is that that's a real conspiracy.
Yeah, definitely.
Because that's very difficult to pull off.
Yeah, and I think kind of a better way of talking about it than just how likely is this thing is a thing you do very well in the book is giving historical context for real conspiracies and what actually it took to pull these various things off, and how kind of narrowly focused they were. You talk about, I think, the Iran-Contra scandal, which is a relatively small number of people, and it did actually come out because it's very, very hard to keep things secret. And if that came out, then much bigger things would also come out. Something like on the scale of 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, Clinton couldn't even get a blowjob in the White House, as people joke. Yeah. Nixon couldn't even get his plumbers to break into the Democratic headquarters successfully. I mean, these are these are FBI G-men who were supposedly professionals at this, and it just shows you how hard it is to really pull off a real conspiracy. I mean, again, Volkswagen got caught cheating the emissions scandal, and these insider trader stuff. Every week somebody gets busted for it. I mean, those are all kinds of conspiracies that are very detailed and narrowly focused, and still hard to pull off. Most people get busted.
Yeah.
I've been reading Edward Snowden's memoirs and his autobiography, and gosh, it's just it is kind of illuminating about the kinds of stuff governments are willing to do. This was under the not just the Bush administration, but under Obama. Mr. Transparency, and Snowden talks about this keystroke. I forget what it's called, Keystone, where you can actually take over somebody's a personal computer and watch what they're watching on their screen, porn, or they're having a video conference with their child or whatever. It's just incredible. He describes that. I'm sitting here watching this father with his little son on his lap, and it's like, what?
Yeah, it is quite amazing, and yeah, that's something you talk about a lot as well. Like, there's one thing. There was an old program that was instituted after World War II, like in 1945. It was Project Shamrock.
All right.
So that was the project that they recorded all of the telegrams coming into the United States from 1945 until the 1970s, until the Church Church Committee, which was quite incredible. I never actually heard of Project Shamrock, but it just seems like the same type of thing going on.
Yeah,
today.
and that church committee thing was really important, which is why it's good that we have those kinds of things. I think we need another one now about the Russian meddling in Ukraine and whatever else is going on that we don't quite know about. Because from the church committee, we also found more stuff about the JFK assassination, including that it was Kennedy that set up the secret recording devices in the Oval Office. Not Nixon. Not Johnson. Kennedy before them. Wait, a Democrat? He's on our side. Liberals say. Yeah, well, so this stuff goes on, and MK Ultra came out because of that. We were doing what? Mind control and all that Manchurian Candidate stuff, which everybody assumed, well, that's just a movie. Trying to figure out how to brainwash people. No, actually, it was a real program.
Yeah.
Same thing with Project Stargate. I didn't talk about that in the course, but this was the CIA's attempt to master this remote viewing, where you have these remote viewers, these psychics in a room in Washington D.C. somewhere, and they're trying to determine telepathically where the missile silos are located in Russia or wherever, or where Osama bin Laden is hiding. No, that came later, but. And so these guys they claim they got hits. It's like, yeah, I'm sure you got some hits, but is it statistically significant number of hits? Are they important hits? And, this is kind of how psychics operate. But the point was, it's like, wait, we spent $20 million testing remote viewing? That's just bullshit stuff. Skeptics debunked decades ago. I mean, the Amazing Randy debunked this stuff back in the 80s. We were spending money on this. The government was, so... Again, we have to acknowledge to the Alex Jones of the world that some of this stuff is real. It does go on. There are, we should not just trust government for sure, and it isn't just the Republican administrations we shouldn't trust. The Democrats they've done just as many nefarious things.
Yeah, well, certainly over the last 100 years or so, like the stuff that was going on was obviously under both administrations. Democrat and Republicans, all the interventions in foreign countries and things like that. Lecture 11, you talk about the deadliest conspiracy in history, which was essentially the events leading up to World War I. Why did you devote a whole chapter to that?
Well, I knew a fair amount about that. I just read a book on the whole origins of the First World War and the causes, and there was a whole section on that. And then there was a film about Princip, Gavril Princip, and
the assassin.
Whether or not he was a what did Oswald call himself? I'm a
patsy.
Patsy, yeah. Where Gavril Princip was described as something like a patsy. Somebody else was pulling those strings, and maybe the strings were being pulled by Serbia itself, the government, as a false flag operation, for their own nefarious things. I thought, whoa, this is so much like the JFK thing. I got to look into this some more, and I did. And I'm not, I'm not super convinced I know the correct answer. I think it was, this sort of Serbian nationalist black hand conspiracy with some other people behind the scenes, but probably not government agents, probably these independent groups, I think. I'm not 100% sure on that. And I was amazed to see that there is some debate about that. But that, whatever the conspiracy, whether it's this black hand Serbian nationalist group or the government itself, this led to this cascade of consequences that triggered the First World War and, tens of millions of people dead. That's a conspiracy.
Yeah, and obviously it was, you could describe it as being a conspiracy theory on the part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and that they used a particular interpretation of what happened to attack, was it Serbia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's where I made that. Also made that link between "Made It Happen on Purpose" MyHop and "Let It Happen on Purpose" LIHOP from the 9/11 truth theorists. That then I called it "Capitalized on What Happened on Purpose" CowHop, which is in a way kind of what Roosevelt did. I mean, Roosevelt wanted to get the United States into the European War, but he needed a pretext for that, and that was Pearl Harbor. So, of course, he let it happen on purpose, or he made it happen on purpose. No, it just happened. But he then did what governments often do. They take advantage of something that just happens and then utilize it for their own political gain. That's a true conspiracy that's a little more nuanced, but it is a kind of a conspiracy.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, and that's, again, like the type of perspective I think that you want to give people. Like, tell people that people exploit things, like the Gulf of Tonkin attacks, or not attacks. They weren't exactly a false flag. It was kind of a mistaken report of an attack, but McNamara leapt upon it and exploited it. Capitalized on it. I'm glad you came up with CowHop, or whatever it was.
CowHop,
CowHop.
Capitalized on what happened on purpose. Yeah,
because I used to call it "Glad It Happened," but then I couldn't figure out how to end it. So it was LIHOP, MyHop, and GIH. So
right.
I will use CowHop now, which is a more fits better in the scheme.
Why I also wrote about Operation Northwoods. Joe Rogan made a big Alex Jones made a big deal about that on Joe Rogan's show. I'm like, wait, Operation Northwoods? Yeah, I got to look into that a little bit more. I forget what the details of that. That came out during the church. Well, actually, it came out initially. Johnson had heard about it after Kennedy was assassinated, and he covered it up because he thought this could be really bad for Cold War tensions if the American public finds out, if the Russians find out what Kennedy administration was planning on doing to assassinate Castro, and also create false flag operations. Like, we'll have one of our jets doctored up to look like a Russian MiG, and then it'll buzz fly some American commercial planes, and that will say the Russians did that, and then we'll invade Cuba. And they had like a dozen different things like that. Now, to his credit, Kennedy said, "We're not doing those things. It's crazy." But the fact that his administration, all the way up to McNamara, were going, "Yeah, this seems like a good idea. Let's do that, and we'll assassinate Castro while we're at it." And it wasn't until Reagan was president that Reagan passed that law. We will not. It's against the law to assassinate foreign leaders.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure he was a little worried himself. Because we had been doing this in South America, backing South American dictators. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Right.
Hitchens wrote about this. He had this book on Henry Kissinger as a war criminal. And I remember reading this, going, God, I never thought about Kissinger in that regard. But yeah, I can kind of see the argument. Now, I'm not sure I go that far, but all the conniving things we were doing secretly, Congress did not know about it, so the public doesn't know about it. So this is a kind of conspiracy to topple certain dictators that were more communist and back dictators that were either leaning toward democracy or more fascist in South American countries, to the point where we're sending CIA operatives, we're providing them with weapons, and people are dying in some of these false flag operations to make it look like the communists did this to the fascists, therefore the Democrats should come in, all this stuff. This is all, came out in the 90s about what we were doing in the 60s and 70s in South American countries. It's like, holy crap, that's pretty bad. And that's a real conspiracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, like I was saying, like it's really important to tell people that real conspiracies happen. That's why I started the first words in my book were that conspiracies are real, of course. And you start out your series like listing all these conspiracies, and you list more in the last lecture. Like you're talking about the real X-Files, conspiracy theories and myth and reality, and you're talking about kind of the real underpinnings. Like in this, it's interesting. It's kind of a switch in a way to go to UFOs. Because I almost feel like UFOs exist apart of it. I know when you were going through my scheme of classifications of conspiracy extremeness, and we get to UFOs, and I think I put it at an 8 or something like that, 7 or 8.
Yeah,
and I could tell you weren't entirely convinced that it deserved to be quite so high on the thing, because it's in some ways it seems like almost like a harmless harmless hobby rather than a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I guess the way I think about it is this, and again, in terms of your strategies for dealing with these people, is to acknowledge that very probably extraterrestrial intelligence exists somewhere in the cosmos, and you can go through all the SETI arguments, and that's reasonable. Now, have they come here? So I separate those two separate questions. Are they out there? Have they come here? Now, let's look at the evidence for have they come here, and this goes back to Sagan, kind of deconstructing the arguments back in the 60s and 70s, and always it's the evidence is thin, it's always questionable, it's not clear. We don't have a type specimen, there's no physical body we can all look at, there's no spacecraft. All we have are these sort of blacked out paragraphs in secret document, government classified documents, and we have blurry photographs and grainy videos. It's always kind of in that kind of questionable area. If by UFO you mean the U means extraterrestrial. Now, to me, if you mean by U experimental aircraft that the government is secretly working on, yeah, I'm sure that's true. Or maybe the Russians have some experimental aircraft we don't know about. That's entirely possible. So there, I would agree with you. It should have fairly high standing.
Yeah. Something a little perspective thing that was kind of surprising to me was you talk about Roswell and how Roswell was a brief flare for things, but then for 20 years Roswell didn't even really make the grade in terms of the most interesting UFO sightings, and until someone wrote a book about it, and then it bumped back up again.
Right, and then eyewitnesses suddenly remembered things that they saw and so on. By the way, you had Nick Pope on your podcast, which I really enjoyed. I've not met him personally. I've seen him on every one of those Ancient Alien shows. I mean, he's like a regular. I don't know if he's one of the producers or what. I don't know what, but he's on every one of them. You would think he's totally down the rabbit hole with those guys. And on your podcast, he's going, I have no idea if aliens have come here. I can't say, we cannot say that. The evidence is not good enough to make that conclusion. I'm like, dude, you've never said that in hundreds of hours on television. But then I've watched a few more of these episodes. They're streaming now on Hulu, I think. And he couches the language so carefully, like, is it possible that? And it could be. And some people are saying that, it's almost Trumpian like, Trump says, people are saying, what people? Oh, a lot of people. Well, wait a minute. And it's hard to pin down that. And I thought you pinned him down perfectly. He said right there, well, you don't know.
Yeah, well, we were just two guys having a conversation. But I think, when you see him on the other shows, he's an entertainer. And, that's kind of how he makes a living is to a certain degree exaggerating things like his experience and his opinions with regards to aliens. Because, he does make a living doing it now. So he, in some ways, is kind of forced to do it. But when he was just like chatting with somebody one-on-one, I think perhaps well,
also he's played up, of course, or maybe the TV producers play up his role as he worked for the defense industry or defense department or whatever in England. That gives him cachet. Like, oh, well, he was on the inside, so he knows what they were doing. Well, he told you that most of the stuff I was doing had nothing to do with aliens and UFOs. That's right.
But it sounds good when he says he ran the British government's UFO program, even though it wasn't really much of a program.
Right. It's like Stan Friedman always. May he rest in peace, because I always liked Stan. But he always made a big deal. Nuclear physicist. It's like, ooh, nuclear physicist. So he must have some inside knowledge about. It's like UFO people when they cite, well, he was a general. So what? Well, he was the town sheriff. So what? They have the same eyeballs and brains that we have. They're no better at observing things. But we want that kind of well, it's an argument from authority. We want the people making the claim to have some credibility.
Yeah. So what do we do about all this? How do we actually how do we fight the tide of disinformation? Like you obviously your course is great in understanding it and giving a lot of context to it. But what do you think are the practical steps that we should be advocating for?
Well, first of all, I think the kinds of things you and I are doing are important. That is, nailing down the details, and not just us, but Snopes, for example, has been at this for a long time, and now there are other groups like that fact checking political speeches. So PolitiFact, for example, will fact check Trump speeches in real time. Then you can kind of watch the speech, and you can go online and see they're checking as he is speaking. And there's a half a dozen of these fact-checking sites that have come to fruition in the last couple of years. That to me is an encouraging sign that we're not living in a post-truth world. The cover story of the current issue of Skeptic has Steve Pinker on it, and he wrote the cover story for us. Are we living in a post-truth world? Well, we titled it, "We're not living in a post-truth world." And so his opening paragraph is the statement, "We're living in a post-truth world," true? Now, the moment you open your mouth, you've lost the argument, because you're making an argument.
Yes.
You're saying, I think there's evidence that we are living in a post-truth world. Wait, evidence? Facts? You mean these things still matter? Just like the anti-free speech people.
Yeah.
The moment they open their mouth to make an argument against free speech, they've lost, because we're giving them the platform to go ahead and make an argument and voice their speech. And, so I don't think we're living in a post-truth world. I don't think conspiracy theories have taken over the world. I think we can keep pushing as we always have, that fact-checking matters, evidence matters, values, the Enlightenment values of truth-telling, that matters. We do want to know what actually happened. I do think not just all these bottom-up fact-checking type sites and magazines like Skeptic and books like yours, but like the checks and balances, the stuff we've seen now during the Trump administration, all the Trump haters, they keep portraying like this is the end of the world. Actually, he hasn't done all that much because of all the pushback he gets and all the legal pushback, and the checks and balances are working fairly well. The whistleblower protection, it seems to be in place. And here, Edward Snowden has one of the best-selling books in America this week. He's a whistleblower. Now, true, he has to live in Moscow. I'm not sure that's such a great trade-off for him, but maybe he'll be able to come back. The laws protecting whistleblowers is, I think, still pretty solid. So I'm encouraged that we're stemming the tide of craziness.
Yeah, I know that a lot of the corporations are working on things as well, partly because they want to avoid regulation, but partly because they want to do good, and they are fighting against things like disinformation and extremism.
Yeah, you saw that with Facebook. I mean, Zuckerberg and so they're running scared. They don't want to be they don't want to be regulated. They don't want to be broken up. Elizabeth Warren wants to break up the huge corporations, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on. I don't think that's necessary. I think just leaning on them socially, has a pretty big effect. So that's working, I think, fairly well.
Yeah. You were a member of the intellectual dark web,
such as it is.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the themes of that are kind of talking about things that are not acceptable to talk about. Things that let's say various issues like gender and language and things like that, and immigration and whatnot. Do you think the themes of the intellectual dark web in pushing back against not being able to talk about things are relevant to like conspiracy theories? Do we need more discussion?
Totally. I mean the shining the light in the dark spots is going to attenuate fear and anxiety people naturally have about those dark places that we know sometimes are real. Therefore, open conversation and dialogue is the only hope we have to solving these problems. If you're worried about discrimination against LGBTQ, for example, the best thing we could do is have conversations about, well, how many people are gay? How many people are really trans? What does it mean to be trans? I had on my podcast yesterday, Douglas Murray has this book, The Madness of Crowds, out, in which he's pushing back against that. And, he's got a pretty big audience and a receptive audience to this. Like, why are we talking about trans? How many people are we talking about? And the answer is we have no idea. There's almost no research on any of this. So, sans research, people just go to these kind of natural prejudiced places. No, let's have an open conversation about every single thing that's of interest to people. Now, you don't have to talk about everything. Point I make, like when I was in graduate school, I could see that the race and IQ issue, I was in psychology. This was already a pretty sensitive subject in the 70s. And I thought, you know what, I'm just not going to do that. I can see why African Americans would not be too happy about this research, and I'm not sure why I'd want to know if there really are differences in IQ between blacks and whites, and if I did know that, what I would do with that. I'm totally supportive of people that want to research that and talk about it. We should talk about it, but we don't have to do everything, right? So there's censoring things which we don't want to do, but you don't have to fund research. Right. You don't have to, encourage people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that are just so touchy that even if there's something to be gained from researching it, it might be offset by the negative social consequences of focusing on it. And I think for some individuals as well, it's you can protest that you should be able to talk about things, but realistically, it's going to have an effect if you want to research things like eugenics or something like that.
Right. Yeah, the whole the thing about the intellectual dark web, our focus on free speech and is kind of a fundamental principle. And we've highlighted a lot, the deplatforming of speakers on college campuses. We don't want that kind of censorship. Okay, first of all, it's not a First Amendment issue. The government is not coming in to tell Milo Yiannopoulos he can't speak at UC Berkeley. No, it's more bottom up students protesting. Shouldn't students have the opportunity to hear Milo Yiannopoulos or Ben Shapiro? Yeah, sure, but the universities don't have to invite them. They're not required to invite every single person who has some weird belief. I would invite, say, a George Will or some kind of centrist conservative to talk about the conservative position so that liberal students have some idea why half of America votes Republican. Yeah. But I wouldn't invite Richard Spencer or Jared Taylor. They're conservative, but they're really kind of right-wing, neo-Nazi type. Yeah, and no, I would not invite them to represent conservatism. You don't have to invite everybody. Yeah. Like a Ben Shapiro, there's IDWs have made much about the grief Ben Shapiro has gotten at some of his campus appearances, and that's true. But he's given hundreds of these talks, and most of them I've watched quite a few online. He's received very well, standing ovation. There's a huge conservative movement on campus. They love him. And he invites people that disagree with him to come to the front of the line, and only a couple do. Mostly he's not deplatformed. The heckler's veto does not shut him down. So while all the incidences that have happened that we're concerned about campus craziness, they're still kind of in the minority. Most of the time on college campuses, things are just going along like they usually do. Most speakers are not deplatformed. Most of the time, students are not burning down the local Starbucks or whatever in protest to the speaker. That's still fairly rare. So I'm not in an existential mode of, we're facing a crisis in Western civilization now.
Yeah. Just a last topic. What do you think of the skeptical community? Do you think there's a viable skeptical community, and should there be a different skeptical community?
Well, obviously, I published a magazine called Skeptic, so yeah. I think we have a viable movement. Just by some background, the modern skeptical movement really began in the 70s when Uri Geller and some of the other New Agers kind of got popular and famous. And a handful of people like the Amazing Randy, Ray Hyman, Paul Kurtz, Marcello Truzzi, a sociologist, and a few others, Martin Gardner, said, we need to push back against these people. I mean, Uri Geller, this Israeli spoonbender, he's like on the cover of Time magazine. It's like, what? He's on these major talk shows. It's like, okay, this is like, who do you choose to take on to be skeptical? Well, if they're big and people really want to know and millions of people are watching, we should say something. And that's what launched the Center for Inquiry, as it's now called, and Skeptical Inquirer, and then we launched Skeptic Magazine in the 90s. But there are dozens of magazines around the world and hundreds of local small skeptic groups and millions of people that, I don't know if they'd call themselves skeptics, but they embrace that kind of skeptical perspective. And what we do is it's kind of specialized knowledge, like what you do. The average person is not going to know how fast a building falls when it's, collapsing. Why would you know that? Most people don't know that. And, or the door doesn't lock on the gas chamber at my who would know these things, right? But skeptics know that. Like how do people walk across hot coals in bare feet without getting burned? Well, here's the physics of it. Now, most physicists don't know that. Why would they know that? Skeptics know that. So it's kind of a specialized thing. That's what we do and skeptics do. I think it's pretty solid. My one concern about it is, this is more really of the atheist movement than the skeptical movement, is being too political. That is, the atheist movement started to get really big after Dawkins' 2006 book, The God Delusion. But then it splintered. First, it splintered about who was militant atheist versus more moderate atheist. And because Richard and Sam Harris and Hitchens, not so much Dawkins, but they're really go for the jugular. I mean, we're going to just drive right in there and debunk these crazy claims, and anybody that believes this God stuff is deluded. Wow. Okay. Well, sometimes that works, but other times that doesn't work. And more moderate approaches that other people take work better. There's no single answer. So the first division was between militant atheists and more moderate atheists, and the next split was social justice atheism. So atheist plus. The plus is social justice. Well, that's kind of a dog whistle label that means something very specific politically, far left, progressive liberalism. And this is very different from kind of more centrist liberalism. And so a lot of atheists were very alienated by that, including me. Like, well, but wait, we all embrace and endorse science and critical thinking and reason and enlightenment values, right? That's kind of a big tent right down the middle. And we all agree on that. But the Atheist Plus are way off to the left going, no. If you can't tick the box for all 12 of these things, you're out. And the same thing happened with the humanist movement and feminist movement and Marxist movement and the Ayn Rand objectivist movement. I think there's a psychology here, a sociology of social groups, social movements. They splinter apart when they fight over little tiny doctrinaire portions of their whole platform. And if you can't tick the box for all 12 or whatever, then you're out. And the moment you start kicking people out of your group's going to get smaller. So I do worry about that.
Yeah. Actually, the last question I had written down was, is the skeptical tent too big? And I think you kind of touched on that.
To me, I think everybody should be skeptical. I mean, people are just they're not thinking of themselves as skeptical. But if you're skeptical of what Trump is doing with Ukraine this week, you're a skeptic. And even if you're a 9/11 truther, they're skeptics. Okay, so the skepticism thing is good. That's fine. Be suspicious of the government. The government does do suspicious things. That's
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
We should all be skeptical. Then it comes down to, well, how do we know what's true?
Right.
And that's really science is our best tool.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you very much. Is there any last words you want to say or touch upon?
Oh, well, just thanks for having me on. Thanks for your important work. The course itself, you can just go to audible.com and get it there. I don't think it's on the Teaching Company website yet, but audible.com or Amazon has the course. And so keep up the good work. And
thank you.
Thank
you. Yeah, and you too. And I really enjoyed the book, and I can recommend it to anybody who wants to get a good perspective on conspiracy theories. It's got some very interesting. I learned some new things, which is saying something, as I'm a long-term conspiracy guy.
You are for sure.
It was
all right. Well, thanks, Nick.